I'm going to start with all the way down on the end with you, General Ralston. You and Bill Cohen, former senator, former defense secretary, with other high-ranking former military officers. On June 15th, you submitted comments to the Interior Department on the 5-year plan, calling to keep the Beaufort and Chukchi lease sales in the plan. You all said, quote, excluding the Arctic from the program would harm our ability to protect our interests and to promote cooperation in the region. Yet, as you heard from Senator Merkley, we also hear that climate change is also a national security threat to this country and to the international order. So could you address why we need to keep those in even if we don't decide to drill them later?
Sure. To start off with, you referenced the letter that former Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen had signed along with 15 senior military officers, all who had at one time or another in their career responsibility for Arctic operations. So I think it's important to understand why that group felt as intently as they did about the Arctic. And you have a handout, a map, that I'd like to spend just a minute on, and it talks about Alaska's strategic location. Unfortunately, every time we see a Mercator projection of Alaska, a map, Alaska is always way up in the northwest corner, kind of an afterthought. If you look at a more realistic map, a polar projection, you will see why in 1935 General Billy Mitchell testified to this Congress of the United States that Alaska is the most strategic place in the world for aviation. And why is that? If you look at that map, from Alaska, you can be anywhere within 90% of the industrialized world in less than 8.5 hours. Now, Washington has never quite understood that. FedEx gets it, UPS gets it. The two major hubs that they have are in Anchorage, Alaska. The Air Force gets it because of the aviation thing. Let me elaborate a bit. The Air Force has 3 wings of premier fighters, the F-22. One of those is in Alaska. Why? Because if you have a few assets, you better put it in a place that can go east or west, wherever they're required to go. The Air Force has 3 bases where we have the AWACS plane, Airborne Warning and Control System, that's very necessary to any combat operation. One of those bases is in Alaska for the same reason. The Air Force's newest fighter, the F-35, the Air Force has just made the decision that they will place it in Fairbanks, Alaska, a wing of F-35s. I could go on and on. The Army, U.S. Army, has 2 brigades in the Arctic. Both are in Alaska. Because of budget pressures, the Army decided a couple of years ago that they would have to take one of those brigades away. Through the congressional delegation and others tried to convince the Army that that was a bad strategic decision, and to the Army's credit, the new Chief of Staff of the Army has reversed that decision. It didn't make sense when you have a small force structure to not put it in the place where you can deploy east or west. And in order to support that operation, I'm talking about military operation in Alaska, you have to have private investment. You can't do that with the military alone. The Coast Guard, critically important. And unfortunately, the nation has not funded the Coast Guard the way they should. We have 2 icebreakers, one of which is 40 years old. The Russians have 41 icebreakers. You saw the news in the last couple of weeks. The Russians just rolled out the largest icebreaker ever known to man, nuclear powered. I don't criticize the Russians for doing that. I applaud their vision for thinking about what's going on in the Arctic. Next month, the first cruise ship, Crystal Cruise Lines, the Serenity, is taking a pass, coming up through the Bering Strait, stopping at Nome, going through, and winding up in Greenland. This is a big deal. Over 1,000 people on there. Do we have a Coast Guard anywhere near that could rescue 1,000 plus people if anything went wrong? No. Why don't we? Because there's no private investment going on. You talk to the people at Wainwright, Mayor Hobson, that Senator Murkowski talked about. They want the Coast Guard there. They want a deep water port in Alaska. And the only way you're going to get that is with private investment, and what we're talking about are leasing in the Arctic waters. To finish up, retired military are very reluctant to sign a letter about anything. It's not what we like to do. But here was a case where people were so concerned from a national security point of view that if you take the Arctic leasing off the table, and by the way, just because they're on the list doesn't mean it's going to happen. Every one of those has to have a full NEPA process for environmental protection. But if you take it off, now you have eliminated your options, while the Russians, the Norwegians, the Canadians, everybody else is drilling in the Arctic. We need to do that.